George Washington, The Cage. Chapter 1. The Man Who Gave It Back. In the winter of 1783, George Washington could have been king. He had the army, he had the loyalty, and he had the grievances. Real ones, legitimate ones, the kind that have toppled governments since Rome. His officers were unpaid and unrecognized and armed. Congress had failed them. The revolution had asked everything of these men and returned almost nothing. The letters circulating through the camp at Newburgh did not use the word coup. They did not have to. Washington called a meeting. He read a letter from Congress, then he stopped, reached into his coat, and put on a pair of reading glasses his officers had never seen him wear. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray but almost blind in the service of my country." Several of them wept openly. The coup died in that room, not because Washington argued against it, but because he showed them what he was and what he was asking them to be. This is the story of how a man who wanted everything became the only man in history who gave it all back. Chapter 2. The Weight of a Name. He was born into a colony that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Virginia in 1732 was a land of tobacco fields and river bottoms, where the planters dressed like English gentlemen, owed money to English merchants, and died having never quite resolved the contradiction. It was a land of performance, a land of men who understood that rank was a costume, and that the right horse and the right coat and the right posture in the saddle could carry a man further than blood alone. George Washington was born into the middling tier of this world, neither poor nor powerful. His father Augustine was a planter of modest standing. His mother Mary Ball Washington was a woman of rigid will and relentless anxiety who would spend 50 years believing her son owed her more than he gave. His half-brother Lawrence, 11 years his senior, was the man who shaped him, a veteran of the Caribbean campaign under Admiral Vernon, a man who had seen the wider world and carried himself accordingly. When Augustine died in 1743, George was 11 years old. The estate went to Lawrence. George got the modest plot at Ferry Farm, a mother who could not stop worrying, and the need to make himself. He would spend the rest of his life doing exactly that. What drove Washington was not ideology. It was hunger, the specific hunger of a man who can see what he wants and cannot yet reach it. He wanted land. He wanted rank. He wanted to be looked at the way the great planters of Virginia were looked at, with the instinctive deference that proper men accorded to those who had earned it. The body helped. By 16, he stood 6 feet 2 inches in an age when the average colonial man stood 5'7". He was broad in the chest and long in the arm, powerful through the hand and shoulder in a way men noticed and did not forget. He could crack a walnut in his bare fingers. He once threw a stone across the Rappahannock, a stretch of water men have measured ever since, trying to decide whether the story could possibly be true. He sat a horse better than any Virginian of his generation, and Jefferson, who hated almost everyone eventually, said of Washington's horsemanship that he was the finest rider of his age. When he walked into a room, men stepped aside without quite knowing why they had done it. The body was not the man, but it was the platform on which the man would build. He was 14 when he began copying out the rules of civility and decent behavior, a Jesuit etiquette manual adapted into English, 110 rules in all. Do not kill fleas in front of others. Do not spit in the fire. Do not speak when your mouth is full. Do not laugh too loud or too often in company. Instructions for the performance of gentility, and Washington did not study them as quaint suggestions. He studied them the way a soldier studies a field manual. He was building a self, brick by brick, year by year, and the man he was building would prove in the end to be more durable than anything else the 18th century produced. He needed to build something else too. He had a temper. It lived underneath everything else, and the men who saw it never forgot. Decades later, Jefferson would tell anyone who would listen that Washington's anger, when it broke loose, was the most frightening thing he had ever witnessed in a human being. Officers who served under him described a man whose face went bone white in fury before it went red. He flung his hat to the ground and stomped on it in front of his cabinet more than once. At Monmouth in 1778, he rode up to a retreating subordinate and unleashed a stream of profanity that a soldier nearby said made the leaves shake on the trees overhead. Generals 20 years older than him went silent when his voice dropped into that register. The rules of civility were not polish. They were a cage. Washington spent his whole life building the cage and reinforcing it because he knew what lived behind the bars. The self-mastery that defined him in middle age was not a gift of temperament. It was the daily work of a violent man who had decided very young that he would not be governed by what he was. Chapter 3. Fire in the Wilderness. In the autumn of 1753, Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia sent a 21-year-old surveyor into the Ohio wilderness to deliver a message to the French. The message was simple: leave. The French had been building a chain of forts southward toward the Ohio River Valley. Country Virginia claimed as its own. The country was not empty. It was the hunting ground of the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Mingo, and the Wyandot. It was the southern flank of the Iroquois Confederacy, the most powerful indigenous polity east of the Mississippi. The French had been moving south from Canada for a generation, building trade alliances tribe by tribe, while the British had been moving west from the coast for a century. The tribes had been playing both sides off each other and growing wealthy on the trade in furs. By 1753, the French were no longer trading, they were fortifying. Dinwiddie needed someone to ride into that country, find the French commander, and tell him to withdraw. He chose Washington. It was a remarkable choice for a man so young. Washington had spent 2 years as a surveyor in the Shenandoah backcountry, sleeping on the ground in weather that froze the water in his canteen, crossing rivers in flood, eating what could be shot or trapped, riding 18-hour days through country where the trails were not maps but rumors. He came out of those years with a body trained to endure and a gift for reading terrain that would serve him for the rest of his life. The mission ran 1,000 miles round trip through wilderness in November and December. Washington took a small party, a translator, a Dutch trader, a few Indian guides, and a frontiersman named Christopher Gist, who had walked more of that country than any white man alive. They moved through forest that was already half frozen. They climbed mountains in deepening snow. They met chiefs and smoked with them and read the alignment of the tribes for what it was. Most of the western tribes were leaning French. The French themselves were polite. They fed Washington well at Fort Le Boeuf, but declined to leave. They were experienced enough to recognize that they were being shown a young man Virginia thought highly of, and experienced enough to know that the answer to a young man's diplomatic theater was a polite letter and a glass of wine. The return trip almost killed him. The horses gave out, and Washington and Gist proceeded on foot through a wilderness now fully frozen. An Indian guide who was supposed to be helping them stopped on a ridge one afternoon, turned and fired his musket at Washington from a distance of 15 paces. The shot missed. Gist wanted to kill the man on the spot. Washington said no. They disarmed him, sent him on his way, and walked the rest of the way out themselves. They crossed the Allegheny River on a raft they built that day, with one hatchet between them. Washington went into the water when the raft jammed against the ice and very nearly drowned. He pulled himself onto a small island and spent the night there with his clothes frozen stiff against his body, then crossed at dawn when the river had frozen solid behind them. Gist's fingers and toes had been frostbitten. Washington's somehow had not. He came out of the wilderness in January. He wrote his report and made himself briefly famous. A young Virginian, alone in the country beyond the mountains, carrying the weight of empire on his shoulders. The colonists loved it. Dinwiddie sent him back the following spring with a small force of Virginia militia, orders to push the French back, and almost no resources to do it. What followed was the opening act of a world war. He moved his men west through May into the Great Forest. He linked up with a war party of Mingo Indians under a chief named Tanagrisson, called the Half-King, who told him a French detachment was camped in a glen a few miles off. What Washington did not yet understand was that the Half-King had his own war to fight. The Iroquois had been losing influence in the Ohio country for a decade, and the French alliance with the western tribes was strangling Iroquois control. The Half-King needed a war between the French and the British, and he needed it to start now on his terms. The 22-year-old Virginian was the piece on his board. Washington gathered 40 men. They marched all night through driving rain. By the first gray light of May 28, 1754, he was lying on a ridge above a hollow looking down at 30 Frenchmen who had not yet broken camp. He gave the order to attack. The French were shot down where they stood. Some had not yet risen from their bedrolls. A few tried to surrender, and some succeeded. Their commander, a young French ensign named Jumonville, was wounded and taken prisoner, and through a translator he tried to tell Washington that he was a diplomatic envoy carrying a letter, that this was not war, that there had been a terrible mistake. The Half-King walked up to Jumonville while he was speaking. He said in French, "Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père. You are not yet dead, my father." He raised his tomahawk. He split the Frenchman's skull. He reached into the head and pulled out the brains and washed his hands in them. Washington was 22 years old, and he was present at this. He never spoke about it directly. He wrote in his official report that the French had been combatants, that Jumonville had been killed in the action, and he insisted on this version for the rest of his life. Whether he could have stopped the Half-King is something men have argued about for 270 years. The Half-King had got what he wanted. He had started the war between the French and the British that would tear the Ohio country apart for the next decade. The shot at Jumonville Glen echoed across continents. The killing helped ignite what Europeans would call the 7 Years' War, a conflict fought on 5 continents and at sea, the first truly global war in human history. Years later, in old age, Horace Walpole would write of Washington in this moment, that a volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America had set the world on fire. The young Virginian retreated to a hastily constructed stockade he called Fort Necessity, a name that captured his situation too literally. The French surrounded it with a much larger force on July 3rd. The rain came down through the day and into the night. Washington held for a long, miserable afternoon of musket fire and mud, and then he surrendered. The terms of capitulation, which he signed in French and later claimed he had not fully understood, included a provision acknowledging that Jumonville had been assassinated. He returned to Virginia in defeat. He had signed a document admitting to a murder he denied committing. The British government treated the entire Virginia regiment as insufficiently martial for regular army commissions. A lesser man would have concluded that the wilderness had broken him. Washington concluded that he needed to learn more. Part 4. The education of a soldier. He spent the next 3 years learning what war actually was. In 1755, he rode with General Edward Braddock's expedition to capture Fort Duquesne, the French stronghold at the fork of the Ohio. Braddock was a professional soldier of the old European school, a man who believed disciplined formations could impose order on any landscape. He had contempt for colonial irregulars and no interest in the intelligence Washington tried to offer about French and Indian fighting methods. Washington rode with the army as an unpaid volunteer aide. He had no commission and no command. He was there because he had wanted to be near a real European army and learn from it. On July 9th, 1755, 8 miles from Fort Duquesne, Braddock's army walked into the worst defeat the British regular army had yet suffered in North America. The French and their Indian allies did not stand in a line and exchange volleys. They disappeared into the forest on both sides of the road and fired from behind trees while the British regulars stood in formation in the road and died in rows. The British officers tried to maintain order, but the men, accustomed to fighting in lines and seeing their enemy, began to break and then to panic. Their own colonial allies were firing from behind cover at the edges of the road. Friendly fire and enemy fire became indistinguishable. The killing went on for 3 hours. Washington was 23. He was running a fever that had nearly killed him the week before, and he had ridden out to the column that morning by tying pillows to his saddle so he could sit upright. When the firing began, he was the only mounted officer left moving. Braddock's English officers were going down in rows. Washington rode through the killing zone all afternoon carrying orders, organizing what could be organized, trying to pull the regulars off the road and into cover where they had a chance. 4 horses were shot out from under him. He climbed onto the next horse each time and rode on. 2 bullets passed through his coat. 1 passed through his hat. A French officer who was firing at him through the smoke later said he was sure he had killed Washington 4 separate times and could not understand how the man kept reappearing on a different horse. Braddock was hit in the chest at mid-afternoon and went down. Washington had him carried off the field on a cart. The general would die 4 days later. His last words are quiet, "We shall know better how to deal with them another time." Washington organized the retreat. He gathered the survivors, broke them off from the killing zone, and walked them back through the wilderness for 10 days to where the supply column waited. He was 23 years old, and 1,000 British regulars were dead behind him. And the men who walked out under his hand were alive because he had not broken. His reputation grew while the men around him fell. He spent the next 2 years commanding Virginia's frontier defenses. An undermanned, under-resourced, thankless command. He dealt with terrified settlers, subordinate officers who resented his authority, militiamen who deserted when it suited them, and a colonial legislature that preferred to argue about money rather than provide it. He sent letter after letter documenting the impossible state of the frontier and the need for resources that never came. He hanged those who deserted. This is not in the school books. The Virginia frontier in 1756 was a place where men who had volunteered to serve were melting back into the woods because the pay was bad, the food was worse, and the Indians were killing settlers 10 miles east of the fortified line. Washington wrote to the governor in plain language, "I have made a gibbet near 40 feet high, and I am determined, if I can be justified in the proceeding, to hang 2 or 3 on it as an example to others." He did it. He had men flogged with 500 lashes, the equivalent of a death sentence delivered slowly, for desertion, for sleeping on watch, for theft from the supply trains. He walked past the gibbet the next morning on his way to breakfast. This was the work. He hated it, and he did it. The frontier was a piece of the world the great planters in Williamsburg never saw and did not want to see, and Washington was the man holding it together with hemp and a flogging triangle and the force of his own 24-year-old will. He learned in those years that war was less about the battlefield than about logistics, supply, morale, and the management of men who had every reason to quit. He learned the brutal arithmetic of frontier command. He learned that ambition unaccompanied by competence was vanity, that competence unaccompanied by patience was useless, and that failure could be absorbed without being consumed by it. Jumonville fought necessity, Braddock's defeat, the grinding frustration of the frontier. None of it broke him. He resigned his commission in 1758, married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children and a considerable estate, and settled into the life of a Virginia planter. For 15 years he farmed and watched. Part 5. The Planter and the Parliament. The years between 1759 and 1775 are passed over quickly in most accounts of Washington's life. They should not be. This was where Washington became Washington. Mount Vernon was the work. He had inherited the estate from his half-brother Lawrence in 1761, and from the day it became his, he never stopped expanding it. The house grew under his hand twice, first to a comfortable planter's residence, then to the long colonnaded mansion that still stands on the Potomac bluff. He surveyed his own fields. He kept ledgers in a hand so precise that historians can reconstruct his daily life from them. He rose before dawn, rode the property on horseback for hours, and was back at his desk before most of his neighbors had finished breakfast. He was a scientific farmer 2 generations before that was a respectable thing for a Virginia gentleman to be. He saw what tobacco was doing to the soil and to his own balance sheet. The crop ate the land and ate the planter both, and he set out to escape it. He planted wheat. He planted oats and rye. He rotated his fields on a 7-year cycle. He bred mules, a fact most Americans have forgotten, but Washington introduced large-scale mule breeding to North American agriculture by importing a Spanish jack from the King of Spain, a gift personally delivered through diplomatic channels. He built one of the largest grist mills in the colonies, and then a distillery to make whiskey from the rye he was growing. He fished commercial herring out of the Potomac and sold them salt-cured in barrels. He was, in modern terms, building a diversified business while half his neighbors were sliding deeper into debt. He was also a hunter. He kept a pack of foxhounds he had bred himself. He named them individually, Sweetlips, Vulcan, Truelove, Mopsy, Tartar, and he hunted them 3 days a week through the Virginia woods. He rode at a hard gallop over country that would have killed an average man. He kept a journal of the hunts the way other men kept ledgers. The fox we ran today, the hounds that took the lead, the ground we crossed. He fished commercially. He shot ducks in the Potomac marshes in the autumn. He had been raised on horseback in country full of game, and he never stopped working that ground. The men who came to Mount Vernon to talk politics were also coming to hunt. The dinners ran long because the rides had run long. The Washington his Virginia neighbors knew was a man you saw at dawn in the saddle and at dusk over a glass of Madeira with his boots still muddy. He had debt of his own. The Custis estate had brought him land and slaves and a comfortable income, but the tobacco trade ran on a system that benefited London merchants and ruined Virginia planters. Tobacco was consigned to factors in London who set the price, advanced credit against future crops, charged commissions and fees and shipping costs, and returned a fraction of what the planter believed his crop was worth. Washington watched the books. He saw what was happening to him and to every man like him. He wrote letter after letter trying to negotiate better terms, and he never quite escaped the debt. But he understood, with the clarity of a man who had read the ledger himself, that the system was designed to keep him where he was. By the time the political crisis began in the 1760s, he had been watching the British Empire for 20 years, and the British Empire had been disappointing him for 20 years. He had wanted a regular army commission and been denied because of his colonial birth. He had wanted fair trade and been given a factor in London. He had wanted the dignity of a free man under English law and been treated as every colonial gentleman was eventually treated, like a child. And then, the Crown took his land. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War had finally ended with British victory and the French driven out of North America, King George issued a proclamation drawing a line down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. Everything west of the line was reserved for the Indians. No colonial settlement, no land grants, no surveying. The Ohio country that Washington had nearly died for as a young man, the land grants Virginia had promised every veteran of the Virginia Regiment, the speculation Washington had been doing with Lawrence's old papers, all of it was suddenly worthless paper. The proclamation was issued because the Crown had just spent a fortune fighting Pontiac's War, a coordinated indigenous uprising across the Great Lakes that had killed thousands of frontier settlers, and London had decided that holding back the colonists was cheaper than fighting the tribes who pushed back when they crossed the mountains. Washington read the proclamation. He understood it for what it was. London telling him personally that what he had bled for he could not have. He never forgot it. He did not need a theory of natural rights to understand that something was wrong. He needed only his own life. His radicalization was slow, and it was personal. He did not read Locke and convert. He read his ledgers and his land patents and his correspondence, and he saw a pattern. By 1769, he was working with George Mason on a non-importation agreement, Virginia gentlemen pledging to refuse British goods until Parliament repealed the Townshend duties. By 1774, when Parliament closed the port of Boston in retaliation for the tea destroyed there, Washington was writing privately to his neighbor George William Fairfax that the time for petition had passed, that the colonists had addressed their grievances for a decade and been ignored at every turn, and that something more decisive was required. He was not eager for war. He'd seen what war actually was, in the forest above the Monongahela, in the mud of Fort Necessity, and he knew that enthusiasm for a fight rarely survived contact with what fighting demanded. The men who talked loudest in the taverns about resistance to the Crown had, in his experience, never had a horse shot out from under them and never would. They imagined war as a kind of public theater. He knew it as a thing of mud and hanged men and burial parties. He went to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September 1774, wearing his old French and Indian War uniform. The gesture was deliberate. He was the only delegate present who had commanded men in combat. It was the kind of thing that did not need to be said aloud. Other delegates remarked on his bearing. Patrick Henry would later say that of all the men he met in Congress, Washington was the most consequential. On the floor, Washington spoke seldom, but when he rose, every man in the room stopped talking. The thing he had been building since he was 14, the cage, the gentleman, the bearing, had become a kind of authority that other men could not name and could not resist. When the fighting began at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the Congress needed a commander. They needed a Virginian to cement Southern support for what had so far been a New England conflict. They needed someone who looked the part, and they needed someone who could be trusted with an army and the subsequent surrender of that army. John Adams nominated Washington on June 14, 1775. Washington accepted, and said, with the unusual self-awareness that marked him throughout his life, that he did not believe himself equal to the command. It was the most honest thing any great man has ever said at the moment of his greatest appointment. Part 6. The Long Defeat. The Revolutionary War was not won, it was endured. This is the central fact of Washington's military career, and the fact most often lost in the mythology that came after. Washington was not a tactical genius in the style of Frederick the Great or Napoleon. He lost more battles than he won. He spent the majority of the war in retreat, in winter quarters, in desperate negotiation with a Congress that could not fund him and state governments that would not send men. What he was something more valuable in a long war. He was indestructible. His first job was not the British. His first job was the army he had been handed. He rode into Cambridge in July 1775 to take command of what was, in theory, the Continental Army. What he found was a New England town camp of 15,000 militiamen who had elected their own officers, who saluted no one, who wore no uniforms, who shaved when they felt like it and bathed when the weather permitted. The Massachusetts men would not take orders from a Connecticut sergeant. The Connecticut men would not bunk near the Rhode Islanders. The officers ate with their men because they were their men's neighbors back home and would be again when the enlistment ended in 3 months. This was not an army. It was 13 tribal levies in adjoining campgrounds. Washington spent 6 months breaking it. He forced shaving, he forced uniforms, what he could get of them. He demoted militia colonels who had been elected by their men and replaced them with officers he trusted. He made saluting compulsory and punished the men who refused. The New Englanders hated him for it. They wrote home calling him a Southern aristocrat, a slaveholder who did not understand free men. He kept going. By the spring of 1776, the army that came out of Cambridge was beginning to look like an army. He had one piece of luck that winter. A Boston bookseller named Henry Knox had volunteered to ride north to Fort Ticonderoga on the Canadian frontier, where the Americans had captured a British arsenal in 1775. The fort held nearly 60 tons of cannon. Knox proposed to bring them to Boston. He was 25 years old, weighed 300 pounds, and had never commanded anything in his life. Washington gave him the assignment. What Knox did over the winter of 1775 to 76 is one of the great logistical feats of American history. He had the cannon loaded onto sledges. He hauled them down the length of Lake George on the ice. He dragged them through the Berkshire Mountains in the depth of winter, oxen and men breaking trail in snow up to the chest. The sledges sometimes plunging through the ice on frozen rivers and being recovered by ropes and prayer. The trip took 10 weeks and covered 300 miles. He lost no cannon. He arrived in Cambridge in late January with 60 tons of artillery he had pulled across New England by sledge. Washington put the guns on Dorchester Heights overnight in March. The British fleet in Boston Harbor woke up the next morning to find itself under American artillery. They evacuated the city 11 days later without a fight. The summer of 1776 was the worst moment. The British arrived in New York Harbor with the largest expeditionary force ever assembled by their nation, 32,000 soldiers, 10,000 sailors, over 400 ships. The mast tops in the harbor, an American officer wrote, looked like a forest stripped of leaves. Washington had perhaps 19,000 men, poorly trained, poorly equipped, operating in a city that was a strategic trap. The British flanked him at Brooklyn. The Continental Army's left wing was cut off and shattered, and hundreds of men were killed or taken prisoner in the swamps and tidal creeks behind the lines. The army should have died that day. Washington pulled what remained of it across the East River in a midnight fog that seemed providential. 9,000 men, their horses and cannon and stores, ferried across by Massachusetts fishermen working in shifts while a heavy mist rolled in from the harbor and made the British invisible from the New York shore. The wind shifted before dawn and the fog began to lift. Washington was still on the Brooklyn side organizing the last embarkations. He crossed at the very end in the last boat as the sun was coming up. He retreated up Manhattan. He retreated across the Hudson. He retreated through New Jersey. He lost Fort Washington, and 4,000 men captured inside it, the worst single disaster of the war. The British under Lord Cornwallis pressed the pursuit. Washington's army crossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania in late November with the British 4 miles behind them. By December 1776, the Continental Army had shrunk to fewer than 5,000 men. Most enlistments expired on January 1st. The men were ragged in a way that is hard to describe at this distance. Many had no shoes, many had no coats, and they left blood in the snow when they marched. Thomas Paine was writing from inside the retreat itself. These are the times that try men's souls. The Congress had fled Philadelphia. The British had gone into winter quarters across New Jersey, confident the war would dissolve with the spring thaw. The revolution, by every conventional measure, was over. What followed was Washington's greatest decision as a commander. The moment the war turned, he gathered his officers in late December in a brick house in Pennsylvania. He laid out a plan that violated every rule of 18th century warfare. The army would cross the Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles through a winter storm to the village of Trenton, and attack a Hessian garrison at dawn. The Hessians were the most feared professional soldiers in Europe, German mercenaries hired by the crown, men who had fought in every European war for 30 years and who had cut Washington's militia to pieces wherever they had met them. Attacking them in winter with an exhausted, starving, half-mutinous army was the kind of plan that gets a general cashiered when it fails. Washington intended to fail or to win. There was no middle outcome. The crossing began at dusk on December 25th. The Delaware in late December was a river of broken ice. The temperature was 18 degrees Fahrenheit at the start of the crossing and falling towards 0 by midnight. The wind picked up off the river and came across the boats with snow in it, then sleet, then a hard freezing rain. Henry Knox, 300 pounds of Boston bookseller turned soldier, the same man who had brought the cannon out of Ticonderoga, stood on the Pennsylvania bank in the dark and bellowed orders across the water in a voice that men remembered for the rest of their lives. The boats were Durham boats, 40 and 60 feet long, flat-bottomed and shallow-drafted, designed to haul iron ore down the Delaware in summer. Now they were carrying men and horses and field guns across a river where the ice floes were the size of farm wagons. Washington crossed with the first wave. He stood in the bow of his boat for the entire passage in a black cloak looking forward, saying nothing. The men working the boats had been Massachusetts fishermen in another life, Marblehead men under Colonel John Glover, and they had brought him out of Long Island in August, and now they were bringing him into New Jersey in December, and they did not lose a man. The army was supposed to be across by midnight. The ice slowed them. The full crossing took 9 hours, and they were still landing artillery at 3 in the morning. Washington had planned to attack Trenton an hour before dawn. He was now going to attack it well after the sun was up, in broad daylight, against troops who had every chance to be ready. He kept going. The march to Trenton was 9 miles through a freezing storm. Men's hands froze to their muskets. 2 soldiers sat down in the snow to rest and were dead by morning. The road went through forest and frozen fields, and the snow was deep enough that the men sank to their knees in the drifts. Washington rode the column from front to rear and back again, his cloak open to the storm, urging the men forward. A young officer named James Wilkinson would later remember seeing the tracks the army made, a line of bloody footprints stretching back through the snow for miles, the prints of men who had wrapped their feet in rags because they had no shoes. The army split into two columns 3 miles out, one under Greene, one under Sullivan. They moved into position in the grey daylight of December 26th with the storm still falling around them. The Hessians had been celebrating Christmas. Their pickets were drowsy. Their commander, a colonel named Rowell, had been warned by a loyalist farmer that an attack was coming and had refused to read the warning. Washington gave the signal at 8 in the morning. The Continental Army came into Trenton in 2 columns at a run. The Hessian outposts fired and broke. Knox's artillery, 18 guns dragged through the snow by hand, wheeled into position at the heads of the 2 main streets and began firing canister down the length of the town. Hessians coming out of houses half-dressed were cut down in the streets. Colonel Rowell was hit twice on horseback trying to rally his men and went down mortally wounded. The Hessians tried to form ranks in an orchard at the edge of town and were enfiladed from 2 sides. They tried to break out across a bridge and found it held by Sullivan's column. The fight lasted 90 minutes. When it was over, the Hessian dead and wounded numbered over 120 and 900 had been taken prisoner. Washington had lost 2 men killed in the action and another 5 wounded. The 2 who had frozen on the march were the only American dead of the entire battle. He stood in the snow at Trenton at mid-morning, looking at the Hessian prisoners being marched through the streets, and turned to one of his aides and said quietly that this was a glorious day for our country. He recrossed the Delaware the same night, with the prisoners, the captured guns, and his own army intact. A week later, he came back across at Princeton and fought again, this time against British regulars under Cornwallis, and won that fight too, riding into the British line himself at the head of his men with bullets cracking past him and his staff convinced he had gone mad. The 2 crossings and the 2 battles changed the war, not because of the casualties inflicted, which were small by the standards of the conflict, but because they demonstrated that Washington was still fighting, that the army still existed, that the revolution was not a summer enthusiasm that had burned out in the November cold. Enlistments that had been about to expire were renewed. Men who had been preparing to go home stayed. Congress, fled from Philadelphia, came back. The British, who had been counting the days until spring would dissolve the rebellion, suddenly understood that the rebellion was not going to dissolve. This became the pattern. Crisis. Endurance. A small victory at exactly the moment all seemed lost. Retreat into winter quarters. Reconstitution. The war was a long string of disasters interrupted by exactly enough successes to keep it going, and Washington was the man who held the string. Valley Forge was the next winter, and it was the worst. 6 months of cold and hunger and disease in a Pennsylvania valley where the army built 1,200 log huts and shivered through a winter, while Congress argued about supply contracts. Roughly 2,000 soldiers died there from privation rather than combat. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, simple starvation. Washington wrote letters throughout the ordeal documenting conditions that would have moved a stone to act. Congress failed to act with any speed. Washington walked the camp every day in his cloak, going from hut to hut, eating the same boiled gruel his men ate, listening to the sergeants tell him what was needed. Foreign officers who arrived that winter, Lafayette, Steuben, von Kalb, Pulaski, found a man whose face had aged 10 years in 6 months and who would not consider stepping away from the army even for a week. A Prussian drill instructor named Baron von Steuben arrived in February with no English and a series of recommendations forged by Benjamin Franklin in Paris. He took the half-dead army and drilled it through the spring, on a parade ground in the snow, teaching them to march in step, to load and fire on command, to wheel and form and reform. When the army came out of Valley Forge in June 1778, it was a different army. It had been through something that made it into a thing the British professionals had not faced before. The war ground on for 3 more years. There were victories and there were disasters. Benedict Arnold, Washington's best field commander, the man who had won Saratoga, turned traitor in 1780 and very nearly handed the West Point fortifications to the British. The Southern campaign saw American armies destroyed at Camden and Charleston. Nathanael Greene began rebuilding Southern resistance with hit-and-run tactics that bled the British dry across the Carolinas. The French entered the war in 1778 and changed the strategic balance entirely. The end came not through a great decisive battle, but through the slow exhaustion of British political will and the strategic genius of a single siege. In the autumn of 1781, Washington marched his army south from New York in a move of careful deception, feinting toward Staten Island while driving toward Virginia. He had been told that the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing for the Chesapeake. He had been told that Cornwallis had moved his army to a tobacco port called Yorktown on a narrow peninsula. The opportunity, if everything came together, was the kind of thing a commander gets once in a lifetime. Everything came together. De Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake and beat the British fleet at the Battle of the Capes, a French naval victory Americans would forget but should remember, because it was the moment the trap closed. The British fleet retreated to New York to refit. Cornwallis was now cut off from resupply and reinforcement by sea. Washington's army arrived on the peninsula in late September and dug siege lines. The siege took 3 weeks. Knox's guns, the same guns that had been at Trenton, the same guns Knox had brought out of Ticonderoga on sledges 6 years before, pounded the British fortifications for 2 of those weeks. American and French infantry stormed 2 key British redoubts in night assaults with bayonets fixed and powder removed from their muskets so no accidental discharge would warn the defenders. Alexander Hamilton led one of the assaults personally and took his objective in less than 15 minutes. Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. The British army marched out between the American and French lines to lay down its arms. The British band played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." The British soldiers tried to surrender to the French, refusing to acknowledge the Americans as their conquerors, and the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, pointed across the field to Washington and said, there was the man to whom they must surrender. Washington had not beaten the British army in any conventional sense. He had outlasted it. He had endured what no other commander of the 18th century would have endured, for as long as it took, and at the end the British walked out of Yorktown because there was nothing else they could do. There was one more death at Yorktown that Washington carried home alone. Jackie Custis, Martha's son, the boy Washington had raised as his own since he was 4 years old, had come to the siege as a volunteer aide on his stepfather's staff. He was 26. He had been a difficult son, spoiled and indolent and unable to settle. Washington had pushed him toward education he would not take, and toward responsibility he could not carry, and the volunteer service at Yorktown was Jackie's late attempt to make himself the man his stepfather had wanted. He caught camp fever in the trenches in the last weeks of the siege. He was carried to a house in Eltham, Virginia, dying. Washington rode hard from the surrender ceremony to reach him, and he arrived in time to be at the bedside when Jackie died. He stayed 3 days with Martha at the house before they took the body home to Mount Vernon. He had won the war. He had buried his wife's son the same week. He went back to camp. Part 7. The Temptation at Newburgh. The war was not formally over. Peace negotiations dragged through 1782 and into 1783. The Continental Army sat at Newburgh, New York, unpaid, unrecognized, uncertain of its future. Officers who had given years of their lives discovered that Congress lacked the authority to pay them, lacked the authority to guarantee their pensions, and lacked the will to address either problem with any urgency. In March 1783, anonymous letters circulated through the officer corps. They were dangerous. They argued that the army had been patient long enough, that the time had come to use the force at their disposal to compel Congress to act. Some among the officers were prepared to march on Philadelphia. Some had begun to discuss whether Washington himself should become something more than a general. The idea was not new. An officer named Louis Nicola had written to Washington the previous year with exactly this proposal. The Republic was unworkable. The country needed a monarch. Washington was the obvious candidate. Washington's response had been cold and unambiguous. He told Nicola that no idea could be more disagreeable to him, that no idea could be more pregnant with mischief to the Republic, and that he was never to raise it again. Nicola wrote back 3 apologies in 3 days. Washington answered none of them. At Newburgh, the situation was more dangerous because the discontent was real and the grievances were legitimate. The army had earned its pay and was being told there was no pay. The pension provisions Congress had voted years before had been quietly walked back. Officers who had mortgaged their farms to serve had returned home on furlough to find their farms going under tax sale. The anger was righteous, and the men proposing to use it had a real case. Washington called a meeting of the officers on March 15, 1783. He walked into the room and looked at the men he had commanded for 8 years. He appealed to their honor. He reminded them what they had fought for. He told them that if they did what the anonymous letters proposed, they would hand every enemy of the Republic the evidence they needed to argue that self-government was inherently unstable, that force would always triumph over law. He told them that what they had built was at stake in this room, on this morning. The officers were not persuaded. He could see it in their faces. They had heard appeals to honor for years from a Congress that had not paid them. They had heard appeals from him before. The anger in the room was thicker than any speech could cut through. He pulled a letter from his coat, a letter from a Virginia congressman describing the government's efforts on behalf of the army. He began to read it. And then he stopped. He reached into his coat again and produced a pair of reading glasses. He had carried them for months and had never worn them in public. He put them on slowly, looking at the men in front of him over the rims, and he said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray but almost blind in the service of my country." The room broke. Officers who had stood firm through 8 years of war began to weep openly. Men who had marched with him from Boston to Yorktown could not look at him. Some put their faces in their hands. Some turned away. The conspiracy collapsed in the silence of that room and never recovered. What had he done? He had shown them, in one quiet gesture, the cost. Not the cost in dollars, which was the language of the anonymous letters. The cost in years and in eyesight and in private life lost. The cost that he had paid and was still paying. He had made them see for the first time fully that the man asking them not to march on Philadelphia was a man who had given his life to keep them out of a war with their own country, and who was still giving it that morning. Every man in the room understood that he had not asked for anything for himself, not $1, not 1 acre, nothing. The grievances were real. He shared them. But he was carrying the entire weight of what the Republic was going to be on his shoulders, and he was asking them to stand under it with him. They stood, every man of them. He was 51 years old. He had been away from Mount Vernon for 8 years. When the peace treaty was finalized later that year, Washington appeared before Congress on December 23, 1783, in the State House at Annapolis to resign his commission. The room was crowded. Congressmen, soldiers, citizens, women in the gallery. Washington stood at the front and read a brief speech in a voice that shook with emotion he was trying and failing to suppress. He thanked Congress, thanked the officers and men of the army, commended his country to the protection of the Almighty God, and laid his commission on the table. Then he walked out. He mounted his horse in the December cold and rode south. He reached Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve. He had been gone for 8 years and 4 months. He was a private citizen again. He had held power, and he had given it back. In the history of the world, this was so rare as to be almost without precedent. The Romans had a word for it: Cincinnatus. The farmer called from his plough to save the Republic, who returned to his plough when the Republic was safe. Washington knew the story. He was living it deliberately. When George III heard from the American painter Benjamin West that Washington intended to resign his commission and go home to his farm, the king reportedly said that if he did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. He did just that. Part 8. The Whiskey and the Crown. He did not stay retired. The Articles of Confederation were failing, and everyone who paid attention could see it. The national government had no power to tax, no power to enforce its own laws, no real authority over the states that composed it. Veterans who had been promised land went unpaid. Merchants operated in a chaos of competing state currencies. In 1786, debt-ridden farmers in western Massachusetts took up arms in what became known as Shays' Rebellion, a reminder that the revolutionary energy that had defeated Britain could just as easily turn inward. Washington watched all of this from Mount Vernon with increasing alarm. He had not fought for 8 years to see the Republic collapse into faction before it had properly begun. The Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Washington presided. His presence was itself a form of argument, proof that this was a serious undertaking by serious men. He spoke rarely during the deliberations, but his weight was always in the room. When the Constitution was ratified and the first presidential election held, every elector voted for Washington. The president had no precedent. He accepted the presidency with the same mixture of reluctance and resolve that had marked his acceptance of the Army Command 14 years before. He wrote in his diary on the day he left for New York that he bade adieu to Mount Vernon, to private life, and to domestic felicity, and with a mind oppressed with more anxious and painful sensations than he had words to express, set out for New York. He meant it. That was the thing about Washington. He generally meant what he said. He had to invent everything. There was no model for what a president was, or how one behaved, or what the office required. Every decision he made would become precedent, what to be called, whether to hold formal receptions or receive visitors informally, how to relate to Congress, whether the executive could act without congressional authorization in matters of foreign affairs. He wrote to Madison in the weeks after his inauguration that he was walking on untrodden ground and that there was scarcely an action he could take that would not become a standard for his successors. He refused to be called Your Excellency. He refused to be called Your Highness, which a Senate committee had seriously proposed. He insisted on the title that John Adams had mocked at the time and history has vindicated, Mr. President. He bowed to visitors rather than shaking hands, a decision Jefferson would later attack as monarchical, but which Washington had chosen because he understood the office needed dignity if it was going to survive. His cabinet contained the two most brilliant men of the founding generation, and they hated each other. Alexander Hamilton was 32 years old when Washington made him Secretary of the Treasury. He came into the office with a complete plan for the financial restructuring of the nation. Funded debt, a national bank, federal assumption of state war debts. He worked 7 days a week. He had been Washington's aide-de-camp during the war. He was the closest thing to a son the older man would ever have. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, was 46 and saw Hamilton's program as treason to the Republic. The National Bank, in Jefferson's reading, would create a corrupt, moneyed class tied to the federal government. The whole Hamiltonian design was an English aristocracy in American dress, a monarchy in everything but name. Jefferson started a newspaper, the National Gazette, to attack Hamilton in print. Hamilton replied in his own newspaper under multiple pseudonyms. They were in the rooms of Washington's own cabinet, conducting a slow-motion knife fight in front of the president. What Washington did with these two was the work of the presidency that nobody remembers and that mattered most. He held them both. He listened to both. He read everything they wrote. And he made the older man's decision. The decision of a commander who has spent his life listening to officers with opposite recommendations. He held them in the room together long enough for the federal government to learn how to function. The temper was working in the background of all of it. Jefferson, decades later, would tell anyone who would listen that in the moments when Washington's anger broke loose, he became something almost terrifying, a man whose voice fell rather than rose, who would stand absolutely still while the rage moved through him, who could make a 40-year-old cabinet officer feel like a junior aide who had failed an order. But Jefferson also said that Washington had mastered this, that he never struck a man and never used his temper as an instrument of policy. He felt it, he contained it, he went back to the work. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 was the test of the new government. Western Pennsylvania farmers had used distilled spirits as a form of currency in a region with almost no hard money. When the federal government imposed an excise tax on whiskey, Hamilton's tax, part of his revenue plan, they refused to pay it. The tax inspector was tarred and feathered. Federal officers were chased out of the western counties. By the summer of 1794, several thousand armed men were gathering outside Pittsburgh, and the talk among them was no longer about the tax. It was about separating from the United States. Washington raised a militia of 13,000 men, larger than the army he had commanded at Yorktown, and put himself at the head of it in his old uniform. He rode west with the army into the mountains. The rebels, who had been talking very loudly about resistance, dispersed before the federal force arrived. There was no battle, there were no casualties. There was simply the demonstration, at the head of an army in the field, that the federal government could enforce its laws. The message was permanent. The Republic had teeth. A government that could put a continental general at the head of a federalized militia and march it west to put down an insurrection was a government that was going to last. He had a temper. He had restrained it. And then, when restraint had reached its limit and the law required force, he had ridden out personally to deliver the force the situation demanded. The pattern was the entire presidency in miniature. Part 9. The Farewell. He served 2 terms and declined a third. The decision not to seek a third term was, in its way, the most consequential act of his presidency. The Constitution set no term limits. He could have served for life. A majority of the country would have supported him. He chose not to. He was tired. The presidency had aged him visibly. He had been the target of newspaper attacks of a viciousness that startled even the men who knew him best. Jefferson's papers had called him a hypocrite, a closet monarchist, a man whose military reputation was inflated and whose presidency had betrayed the revolution. Washington read the attacks. He never replied to them in print. but Martha would later say that he kept the worst of them in a drawer in his study at Mount Vernon, and that she found them there after his death. The farewell address of September 1796 was not delivered as a speech, but published as a letter. Washington worked on it with Hamilton over many months. The central warnings were three. Avoid permanent alliances with foreign nations, beware the spirit of faction which would tear the Republic apart from within, and protect the Constitution as the foundation of everything. He was warning them with the clarity of a man who had watched the founding generation for 20 years, about what would kill the experiment: faction, passion, the tendency of men to love their party more than their country. He retired to Mount Vernon in March 1797, 65 years old. He handed power to John Adams, his vice president, his ideological opponent on several questions, a man he had clashed with privately for years, and did it without drama. The transfer was peaceful. There was no riot, no crisis, no constitutional question. Power moved from one elected man to another, and the world watched it happen and did not understand that it was the first time in any modern republic this had occurred. He went home to his farm. He had, over the decades, reached a private conviction that slavery was wrong. Wrong morally, wrong practically, inconsistent with everything the Republic claimed to stand for. He had grown up with it. His family had owned slaves since they came to Virginia. He had inherited slaves from his father and from his half-brother and through his marriage. By the 1790s he owned, or controlled through Martha's dower rights, more than 300 human beings at Mount Vernon. He had watched enslaved men fight alongside his soldiers in the Continental Army and seen some of them die for the same cause the white soldiers died for. He had watched others run from his fields at every opportunity and understood that this was not ingratitude but the rational behavior of human beings confronting captivity. His conviction deepened slowly. He stopped buying slaves and refused to sell those he owned to break up families. He freed Hercules, his enslaved chef, by negligence when Hercules escaped from Philadelphia and Washington did not pursue him. He freed his enslaved valet, William Lee, outright in his will and granted him an annual pension for the rest of his life. A man Lee had ridden beside through the war and could not bring himself to keep enslaved at the end. He did not free the rest of them in his lifetime. He could not, fully. Many were the property of the Custis estate, and he had no legal authority over them. For those he did own, he wrote into his will that they were to be manumitted upon Martha's death, and that the elderly and infirm and orphaned among them were to be supported by his estate for the rest of their lives. He was the only one of the great Virginia slaveholders of his generation to free his slaves at all. It was less than justice required. He knew it. He died knowing it. On December 12th, 1799, he rose at his usual hour and rode out over his farms in cold weather that turned through the morning into a freezing rain mixed with snow. He stayed in the saddle for 5 hours. He came home with his clothes wet and ice in his hair. He sat down to dinner without changing because the meal was on the table and he did not want to keep Martha waiting. By the next morning, his throat was sore and his breathing labored. By the afternoon of December 13th, he had a high fever and could barely speak. The illness was an acute infection of the throat, what physicians now identify as epiglottitis, or a related condition, and it would have been treatable in any later century. In 1799, it was a death sentence. He knew it by the morning of December 14th. He sent for his 3 physicians, Dr. Craik, Dr. Brown, Dr. Dick, and told them to do what they could and to keep him conscious. He had been bled the night before by his overseer at his own direction. The physicians bled him again in the morning. They bled him a 3rd time. They bled him a 4th. Over 12 hours they took something like 5 pints of blood from him, a volume that would weaken any man, and that, in his condition, was killing him faster. He let them. He had decided to die well. His mind stayed clear all day. He gave Tobias Lear, his secretary, instructions for his will, his papers, the disposition of his accounts. He told Lear to fetch the 2 wills he had prepared and to burn the older one. He wanted no confusion. He spoke to Martha and asked her to bring the will up to him. He gave instructions about the farm, about the slaves, about what was to be done with his correspondence. He told the physicians to stop. He told them, "I am not afraid to die. I have been dying for a long time. Let me go off quietly. I cannot last long." He said one more thing he had been turning over privately for months. He had a fear that ran underneath the Enlightenment certainty of his generation, a fear of being buried alive. He asked Tobias Lear to give his word that his body would not be placed in the vault for at least 3 days after death. Lear gave his word. Washington said, "'Tis well." He took his own pulse in the last hour of his life. He counted the beats. He felt them slow. He laid his hand back across his chest, looked once at Martha sitting at the foot of the bed, and stopped breathing. It was 10 o'clock at night on December 14th, 1799. Martha, after a long silence, asked Tobias Lear, "Is he gone?" He was. Part 10. What he built. The tributes came immediately and kept coming for a century. Light Horse Harry Lee's famous phrase, "First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen," captured the public feeling but obscured the complicated truth. What Washington built was not a monument, it was a practice. He demonstrated, in the most consequential way possible, that the transfer of power could be peaceful, that a man who commanded armies and governed a nation could relinquish both, without a revolution, without a succession crisis, without requiring that the country be remade around him. He did this twice, once with the army in 1783, once with the presidency in 1797. The second time, he handed power to an ideological opponent and did it without drama. The world noticed. Napoleon noticed. When news of Washington's death reached France, Napoleon, who had already done what Washington had refused to do and who would do far worse before he was finished, ordered 10 days of official mourning across the French army. He declared in the order of the day that Washington's name would forever endure with the memory of liberty. Napoleon understood what he had not done. George III, half mad in his last years, was said to have asked the American envoy whether Washington had truly resigned the presidency and gone home to his farm. When the envoy confirmed that he had, the king reportedly said again what he had said in 1783, that if Washington had done that, he was the greatest man in the world. He was not a perfect man. The slavery is not a footnote, but also something that should not be looked at through a modern lens. The temper that he controlled so rigorously was, when it escaped, frightening. His officers had seen it. Jefferson had seen it. It was not a mild thing. His ambition in youth was raw and sometimes ruthless. He hanged deserters and walked past their bodies. He was at Jumonville Glen when a Frenchman's brains were beaten out of his skull, and he never spoke honestly about what had happened there. He was not warm in the way that Jefferson or Adams or Madison were capable of warmth. He was formal, correct, contained. But he had something those men, for all their brilliance, did not always have. He understood that the republic he was building was more important than any single man, including himself. This is rarer than it sounds. Most men who hold power discover sooner or later that the power has become the point. The original purpose, the cause, the principle, the nation gradually recedes and the maintenance of the position takes its place. Washington never let this happen. He remained throughout his life a man who could imagine himself without the rank, who had worked constantly to achieve the rank, but who never confused the rank with himself. The rules of civility he copied out as a 14-year-old boy at Ferry Farm were not just social polish. They were the foundation of a practice of self-governance. Washington understood, before he could have put it into philosophy, that the governance of a republic begins with the governance of oneself. A man who cannot master his own passions cannot be trusted with power. A man who confuses his own desires with the public good will eventually betray the public good. A man who cannot give things up will eventually hold on to things he should release. Washington mastered his passions. He did not confuse himself with the cause. He gave things up. He gave up the army. He gave up the presidency. He went back to his farm and his fields and his ledgers and his debts and his complicated, imperfect, genuine love for the land he had worked all his life. There is a phrase from the classical world he would have known, virtus, the root of the word virtue, but meaning something more specific and more demanding, the full exercise of a man's capacities in service of something larger than himself, the willingness to endure what endurance required, to hold what must be held, to release what must be released. He was not the most brilliant man of his generation. He was the best one. We are standing in what he built. He asked for nothing and got nothing. The country he made is the country we live in. Such men do not come twice in a nation's life. Most nations never get one at all.